Okay, while I'm set up. In this video, I want to introduce some pattern drafting features that you may like. For example, making a jacket with a side body, a double-breasted pattern, and a link button. This may make certain things clearer with regard to altering patterns and drafting patterns as a whole. To begin, I encourage you to trace the forepart and all the details onto some new paper. The absolute simplest way to make a side body is to carry on the center of the underarm dart to the hem. Rerunning the suppression on the side body's new seam, giving it slightly more shape, and what is often done is the hem is flared a little bit, giving it slightly more of a skirt to compensate for the belly dart that we're about to take out. So if in doubt, give it half the width of the dart at the hem. Now the only real reason to have a side body is to add a belly dart. So, carry on the front dart from the widest points at the waist straight down to the pocket line. Where the pocket line hits the underarm seam, mark about 1/8 above and join that to the closest line of the dart. 1/8 of an inch is a very small dart and will do very little, but it can be good for a slim body shape. At this stage, I can't say how and when to increase it, except when they have a belly, then maybe go up to about half. On the bottom side of the belly dart, measure into the pattern the width of the front dart. Lower the jacket at the hem by the same amount that the belly dart opened, and join that to the hem at the front edge. Possibly the best way to draw the side seam is to cut out the side body along the new seam and notch the waist balance mark. At the bottom of the jacket's hem, I just drew sort of a vague point, but that's not really doing anything. Cut out the new forepart so far except for our new seam. Cut out the belly dart. fold the dart closed, the easiest way is to score the middle of the dart and the side closest to the new seam. Place the side body up to the seam, placing the top of the armhole and the waist balance points on top of each other, and line the seam up to the point that we just drew on the lower belly dart. We can trace along the seam. They'll be perfectly balanced when the darts are closed, and they will go together properly. On both sides, I suggest you write plus SA, plus seam allowance, as a reminder, because unless you want to copy off both patterns and add the seam allowance into the pattern, then you'll need to remember to chalk it on when you cut it out on the cloth. The seams don't need any extra inlay, and you put the inlay on the side seam as you usually like to. Something that may be more popular is a double-breasted forepart pattern. It's so simple that you may prefer to make it straight onto the cloth so that you don't have to keep track of an extra pattern piece. This works practically the same way with a whole forepart and a forepart with a side body. We only need to alter the front part of the pattern for now. Ensuring the current pattern has the center front line, trace the internal details in the main shape. We need the neck point, but we don't necessarily need the break line and the neckline. I also want the center line of the front dart going all the way to the shoulder and or the neck and to the hem. In front of the center front line, Extend the waistline out the front. Measure from the center front line, depending on the size, about 6.5 to 9-ish centimeters. It can very much depend on proportions. What is defined as the wrap is how much the cloth is overlapped, so double the distance that the edge is past the center front. You can look at how much it wraps by measuring the same amount on the opposite side of the center front line. I'm just dotting this line. Usually, we don't want the wrap to go past the front dart. Square the new front edge up and down. This is still the sew line, and we will need inlay when cut, basically like normal. Extend the hem to meet the new front edge. This remains as a corner on double-breasted jackets. Above the waistline on the front edge, measure 1 centimeter above it for the new breakpoint. From the neck point, measure the collar stand height towards the center front and join that to the new breakpoint. If you wanted to change the stand height, then that is easy as well, but the stand of the collar must have the same stand height. Make a parallel line to the break line to create the neck and gorge line. Drawing the lapel shape is also an important matter. The shape is generally more curved and is larger, and most importantly, a peak lapel. When you have the lapel width, you want to find half that, then plus a little towards the front edge. Very similar to the normal lapels, because we need the neck and gorge line. From somewhere on the neckline that we currently have, maybe 4 centimeters from the shoulder point, take a line out from there that hits the new break line at about a 45-degree angle. I changed this to a steeper line in a moment, just because I don't like the look of it, which is just the process. These are the changes that we can make. Basically, we create a 90-degree angle on the mid, quote-unquote, point between somewhere on the neckline and the peak of the lapel. We don't necessarily want a perfect 90-degree angle though. Personally, less than 90 is better, offsetting the angle by a small 8. You can raise and lower these as much as you like, but it is usually a relatively small distance between the neck point and the gorge line, drawing in the curve of the lapel. It's practically the same if you just wanted a peak lapel as well, so this is 2 in 1. Collar-wise, the edge of the fall generally wants to be about 3/4 the size of the peak, and I otherwise get into how we might draw the collar later. We can mark the buttons. The first button on the waistline about 15mm from the front edge. Measure where that will be on the wrap on the waistline on the other side of the center front, equidistant. The other 2 buttons can be the same distance below. If we make a straight line with the 2 buttons inside the jacket, measure upwards the same distance once more. The last button that can be marked will be between 2.5 to 3 centimeters towards the inside of the pattern. Personally, I'm not sure about the perfect square buttons. Maybe I would change that to a rectangle in the future. It needs to be pointed out that due to the significant change to the front, even if the original jacket fits perfectly, the balance will be slightly off, so there needs to be a fitting. Maybe there should be one regardless, but alternatively just live with it being a little off. It can also be worth taking a copy of the lapel pattern, labeling it as a double-breasted peak lapel, as opposed to just a single-breasted lapel, peak lapel. Thus, we can apply it to the next pattern and just reuse or refine it into something we prefer. Like I said, I wanted to change the angle of the gorge line, making it steeper, and then changing the peak and the lapel shape to match. Now, here I could have and should have drawn the additional 1 cm seam allowance where we separated the side body, but I forgot. So I would just have to write plus seam allowance again. I am leaving in cutting out the front edge because there are a few overlapping lines here, but it's just as simple as when cutting the normal front edge, except there's a point here. Again, if you just want to keep the original, then change the pattern on the cloth with the chalk. Then you may want to just keep a double-breasted peak lapel pattern to stay quite minimal. To make a forepart with a link button, it is very important that it still has the center front line drawn on it, though you may remember how much you added in front of the center front on the waist when drawing the front edge, so you could just work backwards from there. The point of a link button jacket is that the two front edges of the forepart kiss at the breakpoint and are joined by a button, as one would expect. Wherefore, we need to shave off the front of the front edge and change the break line to match. We need to copy off the internal details and most of the edges, except for the front edge, realistically. With the center front point at the waist, we can square that up a little bit for the break point. Sometimes maybe you'll want a lower break, for example on evening wear, and maybe that's what you want to do anyway. Either way, choose a break point on the center front, and the button can go a centimeter below that. From that point, starting with the new break line, from the neck point, we need to measure towards the center front the width of the collar stand. Join this new point to the new break point. Make a line parallel to the break line from the neck point to indicate the neckline. Then maybe an 1/8 scale below the neck point, make a slightly downward angled line for the gorge line. Or you can give it a peak lapel. Either way, this is just a guide for what to do. Pick a lapel width, and specifically if the type is the same, then we can use the original forepart to draw the lapel shape between the top of the lapel and the breakpoint. Basically the same for the center front curve. We can use the original pattern and draw it back on from the breakpoint to the hem. Honestly, changing the sleeve length is almost as simple as shaving off or adding on however much you are looking to change it by. Here though, I will trace it off to make a new pattern. Above and or below the cuff, mark the difference you want. Say you did a fitting and you want to raise it by 1/2 inch. Draw that new line on. What we need to do though is put the base of the old forearm seam into the new forearm seam and copy off the hind arm seam. Then from the new cuff width we can use the old pattern to draw in a new hind arm seam. And that is literally it. Altering the pattern to account for shoulder pads is literally as simple as pivoting the shoulder lines from the neck up or down the volume of the shoulder pad. What is important to know beforehand is what the shoulder pad allowance in the pattern already is. As far as I know, the allowance in the pattern drafting method that I have published is 2.5 centimeters. If you want to oust the shoulder pad, then move down the front and back shoulder point on the armhole down 12 millimeters, 1/2 inch. I just figured this would be helpful to note. A lapel pattern is something to make preparing the front edges a little bit easier and helping to keep them mirror images. Something like this is generally made after the forepart has been canvassed, after the bridle has been put on, so the pattern will be the correct size. Measure the break line from where it hits the neck point to the break point. On paper, at least that long, mark the start and end. At the top, square off of the mark. Mark the seam allowance below the top line that we just squared off, 1 centimeter below it. We then add the neckline next to the break line to illustrate the stand. Just mark the stand width next to the original line, which is basically the neckline and the top is the neck point. We make the lapel shape. We decide the lapel width and the midpoint and all that jazz. We can use the original pattern for the curve if we want to, lining up the curve between the width of the lapel we marked and the breakpoint. Or just make whatever shape or type you happen to want, be it notched, dogleg or peak lapels. Regardless, marking the top edge of the lapel as well. From the midpoint on the top of the collar, be that at the base of the peak or just where we decided to put it, we should draw on the fall of the collar. It really depends how you like to draw the shape. On notched lapels, I just like to create an equilateral triangle at the moment. With the end of the fall, we need to go back to the center line, which is of course the break line. The fall just needs to be longer than the stand by a centimeter or a centimeter and a half. This is just square across the seam allowance, and then it needs to be joined in a curve to the point of the fall. It shouldn't be straight, but we cannot scoop it out too much because then it becomes progressively more difficult to get the top collar over it. The last line to draw is on the stand side. We just make an arbitrary line below the gauge line to the break line to make the pattern itself, the paper, more durable. We label the stand, the seam allowance, and the lapel the widths that we made them. Just cutting it out from here. The last thing to do is to score along the top of the break line and the gauge line so that they can be folded out of the way more easily and used to chalk those lines onto the cloth. We can fold it in half along the break line so that the tip denoting the break point is sitting on the top where the neckline is.